What's up, folks? I am here today to talk to you about what is perhaps the biggest obstacle people experience in their fight against hair loss. Now, I'm not talking about the condition androgenetic alopecia. We already know how to treat that. I'm talking about the misinformation people are exposed to that strikes such irrational fear in people that they will have lost the will to fight before they even begin the battle against hair loss. Now, it's especially frustrating to me because I have met many people, like friends, family members, who have gone bald, and when I ask them about it, they tell me they considered finasteride, but they were scared of the side effects, so they never started. Or they'll tell me they quit shortly after starting because they read some horror story online and decided to just shave it, bro, for no good reason whatsoever. Now, the internet, if you know where to look, fortunately has a lot of very good information, but unfortunately, it also has a lot of complete bullshit. Now, the problem with a lot of that bullshit is that it gives the impression of being legitimate because it comes in the form of a study that produces believable results. Sadly, much of the data that exists doesn't portray an overly optimistic picture for finasteride, and that combined with all of the negative anecdotes that exist online has created this huge culture of fear and paranoia about finasteride, which is completely unjustified. Now, I know we're living in the dark times, but it's important we don't lose our ability to take a step back occasionally and think critically about information that is presented to us. Now, I know some people, especially people who have mental health problems or hypochondriacs, are going to never be convinced that finasteride is safe, no matter how many facts I throw at them, but I know people have come to rely on me over time to help disseminate information, especially about certain studies. So what I hope to do today is not necessarily try to convince you to use finasteride, but rather help dispel some of the irrational fear being spread online so that people can better decide for themselves if treatment is right for them rather than to allow others to mislead them, I should say. Now, I have discussed this topic several times, in fact, and for a time it seemed like a lot of people were starting to realize how ridiculous the concept of post-finasteride syndrome, aka PFS, really is, and we're not letting all the doomsayers and clowns cloud their judgment about finasteride. Sadly, however, much of this misinformation about finasteride comes not just from all the neck-bearded anti-finasteride edgelords you encounter online, but also even from the hair loss industry itself. I mean, after all, why wouldn't it? Finasteride is the only clinically proven treatment for hair loss that has been proven to be both safe and effective long-term as both a standalone treatment or even more effective as a combination therapy when combined with minoxidil. So why wouldn't the manufacturers of other products want a piece of this pie? I mean, the hair loss industry is right up there with the weight loss industry as one of the biggest scam industries to ever exist, possibly even the biggest scam industry. I mean, companies like Nutrafol, Viviscal, Revivogen, Nioxin, and especially HairGuard know their products can't stand on their own merit because they don't work, so of course they have to fearmonger about things that do work. I mean, I have reviewed and debunked the claims made by these manufacturers. They know their products are scamful, so rather than try to prove their efficacy, they'd rather promote fear and ignorance about the clinically proven existing products because they know that if they can convince you that the risk of taking finasteride are too great, you may very well just try one of their products out of desperation alone. Now, people have accused me of being biased, and it's true. I am biased towards the facts. I am not trying to sell you any product or program. I just firmly believe people are entitled to quality information before making decisions relating to their health and cosmetic appearance. I mean, if you want to see a really egregious example of bias, then just look at the companies I've already mentioned that want your money. I mean, none of these companies care about helping you save your hair because if they did, they wouldn't be making a concerted effort to spread fear about finasteride, which is the most effective clinically proven treatment on the market. Their bias is towards their bottom line, not your hair. And if that means deceiving you into buying a scam product, then so be it. But, like I said, people should make up their own minds. So I want to present some of the research on PFS from a perspective that aims to eliminate a lot of the bias that may be giving people the wrong impression about this drug. So it would be pretty much impossible to go through every study individually, but fortunately there were several recent review articles examining PFS as well as some important original research that we can look over today. So we've got a lot of ground to cover, so let's look at the studies in chronological order, and as always I will link them below so you can review them yourself should you choose to do so. So the first study is from 2016 and it is titled Characteristics of Men Who Report Persistent Sexual Symptoms After Finasteride Use for Hair Loss. They studied 282 men who were divided into three groups. Now, the first group is your typical group of PFS patients, namely men who got sexual side effects after stopping finasteride. The second group were men who had used and then stopped finasteride without ever having sexual side effects. Finally, the third group were men who never took finasteride and never had any sexual complaints. Now, when they compared these three groups together, they found that the average age, body size, composition, strength, cognitive function, and testicular volumes were the same in all three groups. Importantly, though, hormone levels, including dihydrotestosterone, luteinizing hormone, follicle-stimulating hormone, estradiol, sex-hormone binding globulin, androgen receptor levels, and 5A reductase levels were also all the same. This shows that in people with PFS and people without PFS, there is no evidence of any changes in their sex hormones or anything in their biochemistry whatsoever. So far, I think this would indicate that there are no mechanisms that really explain any of their symptoms. This doesn't necessarily disprove the existence of PFS, but rather it raises the question whether the syndrome is more psychological rather than physiological, and fortunately, the next part of the study went on to look at this very question. So, in this part of the study, they looked at some MRI scans of the brain, which is a way to assess brain activity, and in the PFS patients, they saw some findings that are often seen in patients with depression or psychogenic erectile dysfunction, which means erectile dysfunction that is caused by psychological problems like performance anxiety or from certain forms of depression. Overall, this study didn't find any physiologic causes for PFS, and like some of the other studies we'll look at later, it questioned whether or not PFS is more of a psychological problem rather than a physiological problem. So the authors did recommend screening for depression and sexual dysfunction before starting finasteride, but we can't establish in this study at least whether or not finasteride had any kind of causal role in their state of mind, but we do know there is no measurable physiological function that can measure something like PFS. So let's take what we learned here and move on to the next study. So in the next study, which is from 2017, this one was titled Investigation of the Plausibility of 5A Reductase Inhibitor Syndrome. So basically, this is just a fancy way of saying post-finasteride syndrome. But anyways, this was a database study where the authors used the Medline online database to find articles on PFS. And Medline, for those who don't know, it's basically just like PubMed. It's just a source for finding peer-reviewed articles and studies. But anyways, they categorize the articles as high quality to very low quality. So for example, a high quality study would be a randomized controlled study, while a low quality study would be a case report or an observational study with high likelihood of bias. So in looking at the PFS studies, they found only one high quality study, which is called PROSCAR Long-Term Efficacy and Safety Study, aka the PLES study. This PLES study was a double-blind placebo-control study of 3,040 men with benign prostatic hyperplasia, also known as BPH. So they were on a high dose of finasteride, 5 milligrams per day. And for those who don't know, 5 milligrams of finasteride is the standard dose for BPH, and 1 milligram is the standard dose for hair loss. So keep in mind, these guys were on 5 times the standard dose. And these were also in older patients than seen in most people who are in androgenic alopecia studies. The age ranges are usually more diverse in those studies. But in this study, the age ranged from 45 to 78 years old. And given this age group, it's not surprising that 46% of them had some prior history of sexual dysfunction. I mean, after all, sexual dysfunction is pretty common. So looking at the results of this study after 1 year of finasteride use, 15% of men on finasteride and 7% of men on placebo developed sexual side effects. However, in year 2 of the study, the incidence of sexual side effects was the same in both groups, 7% in each group. This is like what we have seen in many other studies on finasteride, and that is that the side effects that happen early will often go away on their own with continued use of the drug. Okay, so how many men had to stop treatment because of sides? Well, overall, 4% of men on finasteride and 2% of men on placebo ended up stopping their treatment due to the sexual side effects they were experiencing. But here is where things get a little interesting. So, Of the men who stopped finasteride, 50% of them had persistent sexual side effects even though they stopped the finasteride. I mean, wow, that's good evidence for that post-finasteride syndrome is real, isn't it? Not so fast. Because of the men on placebo who stopped, even more, 59% had continued side effects. So there were more persistent side effects from placebo sugar pills than from the actual drug finasteride. I mean, this shows why a placebo group is so important in a study and how hard it is to interpret just observational studies without a control group. So this is why I think it is so damn irresponsible to spread fear about finasteride, because as this study shows, it is entirely possible people will get a nocebo effect and convince themselves something is wrong, even in the cases where they didn't even receive the actual damn drug. I mean, the power of suggestion is a very strong thing, and all of this gaslighting about finasteride is not helping anyone. But anyways, moving on, there were 2 other relevant studies found which were classified as low quality, and they were by the same investigator. I mean, they also basically used the same group of patients in both studies, but anyways, the patients were drawn from the investigator's private practice and also from the propitiahelp.com forums, which is a red flag right off the start because it shows that the study has some serious selection bias issues in its use of subjects. So not surprisingly, the 71 and 54 men interviewed in these 2 studies reported high levels of sexual dysfunction after taking finasteride, but we don't know what percentage of the total number of people who take finasteride this represents. I mean, about all we can say about these studies is that there are patients who report sexual dysfunction post-finasteride, which we already know, but these studies tell us nothing about whether or not there is a cause and effect here, or if the correlation is just coincidental. I mean, this study is obviously completely useless because you can't get good data when your subjects already have a negative preconceived notion about the treatment they're given. I mean, it would be like forming an approval rating on Donald Trump's performance as president, but only using Democrats in the polls. In fact, I'd go even further and say this selection bias was deliberate because they wanted the study to have an outcome which suits their anti-finasteride agenda, and they want to spread hysteria and gaslighting about the drug. So, in contrast to this, we have one other study which was identified in the database review, and fortunately, this one was not super high quality, but it was of higher quality, and this was a blinded control study of 107 patients with BPH who were given finasteride 5 milligrams per day for a year. Half of the patients were given warnings to look out for sexual side effects, and the other half were not. The group who were warned about sexual side effects had a 44% incidence of sexual side effects versus only a 15% incidence in the group that wasn't warned. This indicates that a strong nocebo effect is in play here, especially in the incidence of these side effects. So when I tell people to stop reading the horror stories about finasteride and all the stupid hysterical anecdotes from people claiming finasteride did everything to them, from shrinking their penis, ruining their life, and making their anus numb, this study is the reason why I say such things. I mean, if you have a negative opinion about finasteride, you're more likely to convince yourself there is a problem when in fact there isn't one. That is also why I'll tell someone who is really scared of finasteride that maybe you just shouldn't use it. I mean, I hate to say that, but if you can't get over your fear of finasteride, regardless of how many facts are thrown your way, then there's always going to be that risk of giving yourself a nocebo effect. So the best thing I can recommend is just quit listening to all the bullshitters and just focus on the scientific evidence and just take your finasteride like an aspirin and get on with your own damn day. I mean, if you keep on looking for things that could go wrong, I mean, something will just go wrong eventually. So please stop that shit already. But the authors of the study also looked at the studies of the effects of 5A reductase inhibitors on the synthesis of neurosteroids in the brain. Now, I should mention I created a video that already talked a lot about finasteride and neurosteroids called Does Finasteride Cause Depression? And I'll go ahead and link that below in case people want to review it. But in this study, these neurosteroids like allopregnanolone can affect mood and depression, and they found that psychiatric side effects of finasteride were not seen in high quality studies at least, but have been reported in moderate and low quality studies. So overall, the authors of this review of the literature concluded, and I quote, quote, A literature review of adverse side effects associated with 5A reductase inhibitors shows that persistent sexual side effects were only documented in low-quality studies with strong bias selection, as participants were part of an internet blog. The only high-quality study documenting persistent sexual side effects showed that these were more frequent in the placebo than in the treatment group, implying that the effects were not necessarily related to the treatment. A significant placebo/nocebo effect has been documented among patients informed about possible side effects of finasteride, and this may explain the high prevalence of reported sexual dysfunction, including persistent sexual dysfunction, in subjects participating in internet groups and blogs. Psychiatric side effects were only documented in moderate or low quality studies, including studies performed on patients with sexual side effects, which could influence the patient's mood. Most of these studies recruited patients through the same internet patient websites like propitiahelp.com. Unquote. So, if this doesn't convince you that viewing these forums is toxic to your health, then I don't think anyone can help you at this point. I mean, to further reinforce this, let's go ahead and take a look at the Trueb study from 2019. Now, I have brought up this study many times before because I think it is a very thought-provoking study and that it describes what might be a good example of your typical PFS patient. Now, it is just a case report, but it does seem to describe behavior which is common with people who claim finasteride ruined their life. And most notably, I mean, they get very, very agitated when confronted with facts and evidence, and they stubbornly refuse to admit that their problems may be, just maybe, from other causes and not finasteride. So, getting into detail, after 20 years of practice in dermatology, Dr. Trueb found just one patient with classic post-finasteride syndrome. Before going over the case, he notes the history of finasteride. The 5 mg tablet was approved by the FDA in 1992 for BPH, and the 1 mg tablet approved for androgenetic alopecia in 1997. However, despite use by thousands of patients, persistent side effects of finasteride weren't reported until 2011. In 2012, the PFS Foundation was started, and the reports of PFS have only increased since then, which makes you wonder, why didn't anyone have issues with finasteride during the 1992 to 2010 period? I mean, this may be hard for some younger viewers to believe, but the internet actually did exist back in the 90s. I mean, there were even message boards. I mean, trust me, I'm 39 years old. I was around back then. So anyways, looking back at Trueb's patient, he developed sexual dysfunction 4 months after stopping finasteride, and he first expressed concerns about sexual side effects when he was on finasteride after watching a TV documentary on PFS. He then consulted an internet website dedicated to PFS, which was probably the Propecia Help website, and because he was afraid of side effects, he stopped finasteride, and then 4 months later, he developed further sexual complaints. He had repeated urological and hormone evaluations performed on them, and they all showed no abnormalities whatsoever. But instead of being reassured by these findings, he became more and more hostile and even borderline violent. And the funny thing about this is that if you go to the Propecia Help forums and present them with evidence, they will react the exact same way. So even though this is technically a case study, it's corroborated by the tears of thousands of crybaby man-children online. So I think the good Dr. Trueb is really onto something significant here. So Dr. Trueb, he compared PFS to some other so-called mystery ailments, of which there are a fair number, and essentially he feels that PFS is a delusional disorder. He ends up recommending screening for psych problems before starting finasteride, and to stop the drug if side effects develop, and to treat PFS with psychiatric counseling. So basically, his take is that people with PFS are hypochondriacs, and if you've known a hypochondriac, then you know that often arguing facts with them just doesn't work. So anyways, the next study is from 2020, and it's called, and I quote, Post-Finasteride Syndrome, an Emerging Clinical Problem. I mean, that sounds pretty scary, doesn't it? So anyways, this is another review of the literature updated to the year 2020, and to summarize their findings, they say sexual side effects have been found during treatment with finasteride or dutasteride in numerous, although not all, studies. Like, for example, one controlled study of 762 men from 2019 actually showed no sexual side effects during or after finasteride treatment, but of course you won't hear any people from the Propecia Help forums bring that one up. Now, interestingly enough, though, the incidence of sexual and psychiatric side effects is higher with low dose 1 milligram per day compared to high dose 5 milligrams per day of finasteride. I mean, that's surprising, but does this make any sense whatsoever? Of course it doesn't, but here is something to consider. People on 1 milligram of finasteride are typically younger, since hair loss can happen as early as your teenage years. But people on 5 milligrams of finasteride are prescribed that dose for BPH, which is a disease that affects nearly exclusively old people. So we know, just as a fact of culture, younger generations like millennials and Gen Z are more active online than people from the boomer or silent generation. So perhaps young people are more susceptible to a nocebo effect, since they're more likely to look for data online and come across absolute bullshit websites like the Propecia Help Forum. Seriously, guys, treat that crappy forum like the Bird Box monsters and just don't look, or else something horrible might happen. So the investigators also note that studies of PFS patients come mostly from the Propecia Help Forums, and many of these patients show evidence of psychiatric complaints as well as sexual complaints. In fact, in one study titled Emotional Consequences of Finasteride, Fool's Gold, that I referenced in a previous video, more than half of PFS patients had a history of a pre-existing medically confirmed psychiatric diagnosis before they even started finasteride. So the evidence that finasteride caused these issues is non-existent. I mean, most of them already had issues. I mean, the other 50% probably gave themselves a nocebo effect since they were associated with the Propecia Help Forum. So like I said, if you look at the Bird Box monster, bad things will happen. I mean, it's obvious at least a good portion of these people with PFS have a pre-existing condition or a pre-existing susceptibility to depression, and that depression is the underlying cause of sexual dysfunction as well. I mean, they likely just took it for granted until they could scapegoat finasteride for all their problems. So finally, in this literature review study, the authors note that PFS doesn't seem to affect women, interestingly enough, or at least there were no reports of it at the time the study was published. I mean, this seems pretty strange to me because women can absolutely get depression, and even though they don't have penises, well, at least most of them don't, they can still get sexual dysfunction like low libido, anorgasmia, or some kind of vaginal turgidity that makes penetration difficult. So it's pretty questionable that women don't ever get PFS, but maybe that's because nobody has told them yet it exists. I mean, God help women if they ever discover the Propecia Help Forums. I mean, yikes, that would be awful. So anyways, the authors conclude that we need high-quality studies with long-term follow-up to determine if PFS really exists, and if it does, what the incidence is. If it does exist, is it mediated by neurosteroids, and would neurosteroid treatment help? I mean, none of this is clear at the moment, and given the absurdity of the anti-finasteride fearmongers, I doubt there will ever be much of an academic effort to find out if PFS is in fact real, because researchers probably have better things to do with their time, like try to find cures for actual diseases that affect real people who have lives outside of internet forums. So the final study that I will mention is also from 2020, and it's entitled Post-Finasteride Syndrome, a Surmountable Challenge for Clinicians. This single-authored study is another database review of earlier studies, but the author here is clearly more sympathetic to the existence of PFS than the earlier studies I've reviewed here. So looking at the studies on finasteride, he notes that sexual side effects have been reported in most studies, though there are limitations such as no standardized assessments of side effects, and some studies use patient interviews where patients might downplay side effects due to things like embarrassment. And he also notes many studies were drug company funded, and he questions if they are biased, but interestingly, he doesn't point out that the PFS Foundation also funds their own studies and is unfathomably biased against finasteride. He then goes over several very large meta-analyses looking at the incidence of side effects while taking finasteride, and again, the results are inconsistent. For example, there was a meta-analysis which included 46,733 patients who saw an increased risk of erectile dysfunction while on finasteride, whereas a study of 12,346 patients saw no increased risk. So I'm guessing the 46,733 patients Googled PFS online, whereas the 12,346 patients didn't have access to the internet or something. So I think, though, that most of the data shows that there is some obvious risk of sexual side effects on finasteride, but that's something nobody denies whatsoever. I mean, everybody knows that there are potential side effect risks. I mean, we just get into the loony bin territory when people start making stupid claims like the side effects are irreversible. The author then brings up the PLES study I mentioned earlier, which again found that 50% of the patients who stopped finasteride had persistent sexual side effects, but he neglects to mention that the placebo group had an even higher incidence of persistent sexual side effects, which makes no sense at all, and the fact that he didn't bring this up seems pretty misleading to me. I mean, this guy is a researcher, or he's supposed to be a researcher at least, so it seems he should have noticed this inconsistency, especially since I did, and I'm not a researcher, I'm just some random dude on the internet. So he then sums up the case against and for PFS, and fortunately he notes that there are many studies showing the safe use of finasteride in both benign prostatic hyperplasia as well as androgenic alopecia without significant side effects, and that the side effects often resolve with continued treatment. And he notes that there is a lack of high-quality studies showing persistent side effects after stopping finasteride, and he also notes that there is evidence of pre-existing psychiatric issues or elements of delusions in patients who claim to have PFS. So even though he has some biases, he's at least kind enough to make a case against PFS, so he's fair and balanced, kind of like Fox News. So on that note, he unfortunately decides to make a case for PFS by noting that there are reports of sexual side effects after stopping finasteride, though of course these are not high-quality studies because there are no high-quality studies on the subject which exist whatsoever. And as we've seen, and as I've mentioned, there are some MRI abnormalities seen in some PFS patients, compatible with psychogenic erectile dysfunction and depression. There is some evidence of altered neurosteroid levels in PFS patients, though these changes are also seen in depression due to other causes, so there's no real way to establish causation here. Finally, he quotes one database study that found 47 PFS patients out of 4,274 men on finasteride, which would give an incidence of PFS as about 1%, but this is highly misleading. I mean, this is not prospective data, and also another way to look at this data is that he initially searched 2.4 million individual health records and found 47 cases of PFS, which is an overall incidence of 0.0016%. The point is, there is no evidence this syndrome even exists, let alone its incidence. So that's the data. Obviously, there are hundreds of studies, but the big review articles I mentioned cover most, if not all, of these studies. So for those of you who skipped ahead a bit or just lost track of what I was saying, here's what I conclude, and here's what I just sum up. So number one, most studies show there's a small but real incidence of sexual dysfunction and depression as side effects of finasteride, but this is while you are taking finasteride, not afterwards. The side effects are rare, mild, and often go away with continued use and will always go away when you stop taking it. 2. PFS remains controversial even in recent literature reviews. It is taken about as seriously by researchers as astronomers take astrology, chemists take alchemy, or personal trainers take athlete X's strength training advice. 3. If it exists, its incidence is unknown since there are no prospective studies on the subject whatsoever. 4. There are no persistent hormonal effects after stopping finasteride, so even if finasteride did cause short-term side effects due to endocrinological changes, they should reverse upon cessation of use. 5. Some people appear to be predisposed to PFS because they have a pre-existing psych condition. This likely isn't helped by all the fear-mongering online, which leads me to number 6. There is evidence of a strong nocebo effect due to things like TV reports, internet forums, and lawsuits against finasteride. I mean, keep in mind, most people taking finasteride don't even know how it works, and therefore they're going to be more impressionable to people who prey off their fears. 7. The evidence provided does not support the notion of irreversible sexual side effects or mental side effects after stopping finasteride. 8. The burden of proof that post-finasteride syndrome exists is on the people who are making the claim. What has been published so far isn't sufficient, and I doubt future studies will prove me wrong. So, I know a lot of people aren't going to like the things I have said in this video, and that's okay. I am not here to provide a safe space for finasteride's critics. I mean, there are already plenty of those online, and you're definitely not going to find one from me here. So I didn't create this video to troll or to make anyone feel bad, but rather because the garbage conspiracy theories against finasteride being spewed on the internet nonstop every day have remained unchallenged for far too long, and I feel it's important that people are presented with information that isn't so blatantly lopsided as they've been fed so for so many years already. I mean, at least 10 years at least, or 9 years if it was 2011. I mean, finasteride, it's an amazing drug. It has done more to save my hair than anything else I have ever used, and my only regret is that I didn't start it sooner, and I know I don't speak alone on this subject. I mean, millions of people's lives have been improved by suppressing their DHT. Finasteride is one of the most prescribed drugs on the planet, and nobody has the right to tell you that your hair shouldn't be important to you, and you should never be shamed into wanting to fight for something that you value about yourself. And if one of the things you value about yourself is your hair, then there's absolutely no shame in that. I mean, the people who really should be ashamed of themselves are those who try to frighten you into following a path that benefits them at your expense, whether that be those who are trying to sell you some garbage product that doesn't work, like, any of HairGuard's products, or those who want to tell you that you should join in their bald misery and just shave it, bro. Now, like I said, I have covered this subject before, and it's possible I will bring it up again in the future. But if you've gotten this far in the video, I mean, thank you. I know it was a long video. And even if you decide against using finasteride, I am at least grateful that you took the time to hear another side to the story. And ultimately, what you choose to put in your body is your choice. So, to sum up this video, I'm going to go ahead and quote one of my heroes growing up, and that, of course, is Colonel Ratchuk from Starship Troopers. "Figuring things out for yourself is the only freedom anyone truly has. Use that freedom. Make up your own minds." Have a good night.